In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the backing shield on the rear axle of this Ford F-350. We're going to have to take the brakes and the wheel hub off for this, so let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. Sometimes these wheels have some center caps, so you're going to want to use a pry bar or screwdriver to pop that off before you get to the lug nuts. Usually if you just look around, there's going to be a cutout at some point that you can use to pry out on. And that exposes your 8 21mm headed lug nuts, so let's take those off. With those off, remove the wheel and set it aside. Let's remove the caliper and bracket assembly. We're going to remove the 2 21mm headed bolts that hold this onto the rear axle. These might be difficult to reach because of clearance here, so use a swivel socket with a power tool or break them free with a breaker bar and then remove them by hand. Leave this one in a few threads so it can hold this on while we remove the top one. Take that out, remove the caliper and bracket assembly with the pads right off of the rotor. I don't want to put pressure on this brake hose, so I don't want to hang it by it, but what I do have is a bungee cord, so I can hang it on that right behind the shock absorber. And now remove the rotor. Sometimes it's stuck on here. Mine's new, so it's not going to be stuck, but if yours is, you can hit the side of it with a hammer. That should help break it free without damaging the braking surface or potentially hitting the studs or the threads of them if you're hitting right here. All right, on the side, on each shoe, you'll see this spring clip with a pin going through it. My pin is actually not attached to the backing plate, and that's why it's loose, but regardless, you're gonna do the same thing to loosen it up and unhook it really. You're gonna twist this spring off and remove it, and then you can push the pin through and remove that. Mine is stuck here just because it's jammed in where it is, so I'm gonna have to take it off with the shoe, but you can remove your pin and do the same to the other shoe. A little bit hard to see right here, but there's a spring and then our adjuster. Let's pop the spring off, which actually sometimes can be easier if we not only close up this adjuster, but remove it completely. So let's grab a pry bar. All right. All right, take that out. Inspect all these items that you remove. We're going to reuse the hardware. I'll show you how to loosen that adjuster up and lubricate it. For now, let's remove the shoes. Taking these off, you can easily use a pry bar. Pry them out of their slot at the top. That will loosen tension on the spring, and then you can remove the other shoe. And there they are. Twist them apart to get the spring off. This spring is in great shape. There's your shoes. With a collection bucket underneath to catch the gear oil that's going to leak out, remove all of the 15mm headed bolts, bolting the axle onto the hub. There we go. Pry that out. Now gently and carefully pull the axle away. At this point, we have to remove the ratcheting nut that is in there to release the hub. Typically, you would use this tool right here. This goes right on it. It's meant for it. It's got the little pins that lock it in, and this in the center, that makes it sit right inside the axle tube. So slide it over, turn it until it locks in, and then put your 1/2-inch drive ratchet on it. Keep in mind that the driver's side will actually have left-hand threads, so it's reverse threaded, while the passenger side will have regular threads. And that's just because of the direction that the wheels spin in most of the time. Just in case this nut starts unthreading, well, it can't if it's left-handed threads. Having said that, you're gonna want to turn to the right so as if you were tightening to loosen this up. Also, while you do that, you want to press in so that you can push that ratcheting mechanism away so it can actually turn. Once you get it far enough, it should just unthread by itself. Set that aside. Now you should be able to wiggle this just enough to pop that outer bearing out, and with a magnet you can fish it right out of there. Set that aside. Now using a pry bar, pry this from the back to pop it off of the axle. It moves, but the seal's holding it in place. There it goes. Take this off, inspect this, and make sure that it is in good shape, especially if you had a failed bearing of some sort. And you want to make sure that you clean everything so you can thoroughly inspect it. This is the other half of our seal, which we will have to remove, which you can simply do with either a pry bar or a chisel. Everything looks good here, so let's get that seal off. Since we're here, let's clean off the area that the seal rides on. I want to get all of this rust off. I want to make sure that it's clean and free of any debris. This all looks great. The seal doesn't actually go all the way on, so it only goes up until where the rust starts. So I'm not worried about it. This looks perfect. If you wanted to clean up some of the rust, you can, but you definitely don't want to touch this surface, which is perfectly machined to seal up. Now from the back side, we are going to have to remove the parking brake cable so that we can actually separate all of this. And there's a spring here that's kind of in the way of a couple clips that hold this into the backing plate. The best way to do this is to get really any sort of tool that is able to hold the spring out of your way. I'm just using a metal trim tool, but if you have a screwdriver or a pry bar that fits in here, really anything that'll hold it like this so that you can actually access these little tabs that you have to pry on to unlock the cable. Now you just want to push these down, pull the cable through, just like that. You can let go of this now, finish pulling the cable. Take it out of that slot. Now you'll be able to disconnect it from here just by twisting it, turning it, and making it basically come off in just the right spot. There we go. Set that aside. Now you can pull this through. On the back side of the backing plate, you'll see this 10mm bolt holding on the ABS sensor that goes right through. So let's unbolt it and pull the sensor out. Now let's gently pry the ABS sensor off of the backing shield. Sometimes if it doesn't pop right off, you can use some pliers, clamp onto it gently and twist it. Just be careful, whatever you do, not to break it. There it is. Now let's use a 24mm socket and remove the 4 mounting nuts holding this backing plate and backing shield onto the rear axle. You'll need a shallow socket with a breaker bar, a long one, so you can get some leverage. It is probably going to be impossible to get any sort of power tool in here, and also these are very tight. If you need to use some heat on them, go ahead, but break them free and then remove them. Now you can use a hammer to separate this from the axle. Slide this off,
To separate the backing plate from the backing shield, we're gonna have to punch these studs out. I have it set up on my vise. It's not really mounted, but it's just sitting flat so I can hammer these down while this is being supported. So obviously make sure you have plenty of clearance with however you support this underneath so that you can punch this through. Take a hammer, careful of the threads because we are reusing these studs, punch these out. Take this off, and there's the old backing shield. Here's the backing plate. We have quite a bit of cleanup to do. Remove the old boot as well. For the parking brake lever, we're gonna replace that. Clean all of this up. In here, everywhere where anything mounts, you want it nice and clean, so take a wire brush, a sanding disc, whatever is needed to get all of this rust-free, and then we'll apply anti-seize on this whole surface so it doesn't corrode in the future. I have this backing plate as clean as it's going to be. I'm going to set it down just like this, and I'm going to put a little bit of grease right here and inside of the holes, and this is going to allow the studs to slide in just a little bit easier, and it's going to create a nice anti-corrosive coating. You could use anti-seize if you want, really anything that's going to prevent rust from building up and allow the studs to just slide in a little bit smoother. Take the backing shield and line it up. Of course, make sure you have the correct one. Take your studs and punch them in one at a time. I cleaned the surface where the backing plate mounts to the axle as well, so I'm going to apply some anti-seize on this, or grease if that's what you have. That way it doesn't corrode in the future. You want to make sure this is a nice flat surface so that everything can mount evenly and not at a slight angle, because anything that mounts at a slight angle here will end up affecting the brakes. And slide this over, line up all the mounting holes, just like that. Let's reinstall all the mounting nuts and snug this back up. With these tightened up with my long ratchet, I'm going to put my breaker bar on with a pipe for leverage on there and give them another 1/8 of a turn to get them nice and tight. Let's get the ABS sensor reinstalled, slide it through, make sure it's fully seated, slide that bolt in, and tighten it down. This doesn't need to be very tight, it bottomed out, just give it a little bit extra, about 1/8 of a turn at most, that's plenty. Install this little rubber piece that goes through where the parking brake lever goes. Of course, make sure you don't pull it through too much, but make sure it locks in and is flush. And then take the lever and put that through. Take that parking brake cable and slide it through the end of the lever. This part might be a little tricky because it's just gonna want to move. And once you find the angle that this wants to go in at, it'll just kind of pop right into place. There we go. Now you want to pull this spring back and get the cable through its slot to lock it in. Just like that. Perfect. With the hub in a vise, I'm able to use a pry bar, put some pressure on the seal sideways, and slowly work it out of its groove until it pops out. Oh, there we go. It's time to install our seal.
drop it down, and because this truck has ABS, it's got this tone ring here. So usually I would use a flat piece of wood and a rubber mallet and just hit this seal all the way down until it is fully seated, but I can't do that because of this. So I'm still going to use a piece of wood, but what I'm going to do is use a bearing race that fits perfectly on the outside of this seal. That's going to make it so I'm only putting pressure on this outer ridge of the seal as opposed to the seal itself, the rubber part, which would damage the seal. So put your piece of wood on top just to have a flat surface to hammer on. I'm going to use a rubber mallet and drive this down all the way. All right, that's flush all the way around. It's driven in perfectly flat. So this is good to go back on the truck. Let's give this a quick wipe down to make sure that it's free of debris and clean. Minimal oil on it. It's okay if it's a little bit oily, but as long as it's clean, we're good to go. Now take your wheel hub with the bearings and slide this right over very gently in order to not ruin the seal that's in the back. Once you get most of the way on, push it. And you can use a rubber mallet to finish seating it to where the seal actually pushes all the way on. Let's take out our rag that we put in here and slide this in. And finally, the nut that secures it all together. On the back side, you'll see that it has this little tab. This tab needs to line up with the cutout on the axle tube, otherwise it won't go on. And remember, the driver's side is reverse threaded, so you're going to have to turn it counterclockwise to thread it on. Stick your special socket in and tighten it up. Okay, so you want to make this tight, that way you can seat the bearings. You'll feel that as you make this tighter and you try to spin the hub, it's going to get more difficult to spin. That's normal. Yeah, right now it is pretty snug, but it's important to do this because that's the only way to seat those bearings in place. And, of course, finish seating the hub onto the axle. It's important to spin it so that you can help these bearings seat. But, of course, this is way too tight. So after you're done, we're going to have to back this off. Otherwise, the bearings are going to fail pretty much immediately. So, back this off a little bit. That spins freely now. And we're going to tighten it until it feels snug, but still spins freely. It's a little too tight right there, but right there feels pretty good. Basically, too tight and you'll destroy the bearings from them being clamped on and overheating and way too much pressure on them. Too loose and you'll destroy the bearings because they are wobbling around and the hub isn't actually seated on the taper of those bearings properly. So once you get it just right, you can move on. You want it to spin freely, like I said, with very minimal resistance, and this should feel somewhat snug. It's time to put the axle in, and on the end of the axle right here where it mounts to the hub, there's going to be an O-ring. Replace it if necessary. This is what seals things up. There's no gasket or RTV needed on the outside. And of course, make sure the surfaces are clean, both on the axle as well as on the hub side. Not just here, because it does need to mount flush, but also here where the O-ring sits. Now put the axle in carefully. It's going to be inevitable for it to rest and slide on the differential tube, but just try to be gentle about it and don't push it. Don't try to drag it along the whole way. And once you get most of the way in, you'll feel that it needs to lift up on the end. That's so it can fall into the gears on the differential itself, and you might need to spin it or twist it at the same time so that you can line up the splines. You're not going to be able to see anything you're doing, but eventually it'll pop in. There we go. Perfect. Now before we put these bolts in, you want to make sure you clean all the threads in here with some brake parts cleaner. You don't want oil getting stuck back there, so use brake parts cleaner and some compressed air to blow them out. Clean the threads of the bolts, and then we'll apply some blue thread locker to all of these so that they can stay locked in tight. I got the threads cleaned and thread locker on all the bolts, so I'm going to install them into the hub to lock in the axle. Here's the deal with the torque for these. If you have a Ford axle, you're going to torque these to 37 foot-pounds in a cross pattern, and then an additional 90 degrees also in a cross pattern on all of these bolts. If you have a Dana axle, it's just straight up 98 foot-pounds in a cross pattern, and you're done. I have a Ford axle, so I'm going with 37 foot-pounds and then 90 degrees. Now, because I bottomed these out with an impact, they are way above 37 foot-pounds, so I'm going to loosen them up, torque them, and then additional 90 degrees after that. In order to keep this hub from spinning, I'm going to put a pry bar in between the lug studs to keep it steady while I do all that. That was 37 foot-pounds. Let's go for 90 degrees, which is a quarter turn. I have a digital torque wrench that does read degrees, but if you don't, just mark them and eyeball 90 degrees. You don't have to be spot on as long as you're close. All right. Those are all tight. Now, in all honesty, 90 degrees felt a little too tight for me, so I went about 60. It's a little bit less than a quarter turn, but that is very tight, so we're good to go here. Let's prepare the backing shield for some parking brake shoes, and these little divots or bumps that it has here are actually where you want to apply some brake grease or high temperature silicone paste that is rated for brakes, and that is so that the parking brake shoes don't squeak when they go on and operate. I'm also going to put some silicone paste right where they sit at the top. That way, once again, they don't squeak, but also they won't seize over time. I'm going to do the same to the other side of this shield, and then we'll install them. Put some of that same brake grease or silicone paste right on the threads over here, and work that into the threads. That way, well, it doesn't seize in the future. Take this little star wheel and bring it in all the way. Not only does it have to be like that when we install it, but it helps to work that grease into the threads, like I said. There we go, and apply some on the very end so that all of the threads can be properly coated. Put these two halves back together, and this is now ready to be installed. It's time to install the shoes, and I'm going to make sure that the smaller cutout is at the top with this rectangular cutout for where the spring goes. Now what you want to do is take the spring and make sure that the hook part is facing towards the back of the shoe as well as pointing down so that it can hook in to this cutout and sit flat up against it. If you look from the back side, it'll have to follow the curvature of this shoe. Now you take the other shoe and you do the same thing, hook it in, and now we'll have to stretch this over the top and actually install the shoes. This part will be quite tricky. Be very careful of pinch points so you don't hurt yourself. All right, so I got it seated. Obviously the shoes want to come off of here. They're pulling away. That's normal. The spring is under quite a bit of tension. Now what you want to make sure is that everything is fully seated here.
So grab a screwdriver, pry bar, pry on things, make sure that it is in position, because that will make it easier to install the rest of your hardware. Everything is seated on this lever. It's okay if it doesn't touch this top mounting point here. So let's grab the pins and lock the shoes in. Stick the pin through the backing shield and through the shoe. And for these, because they're a hook style, what I found easiest, if you put a little bit of grease right on the end of the clip here, that's actually going to make it easier to hook it on. Okay, make sure that's fully seated, and then we'll do the same to the other side shoe. Let's put in the spring and, of course, the adjuster at the bottom. The spring goes into a couple little cutouts that are right at the base here where it's a little bit difficult to see. So I'm going to put that in first because it's easier to push these shoes together to get the spring hooked on, and then I can just use a pry bar to separate them to get the adjuster in. The adjuster is lubricated and it's ready to go, and it is not directional because this doesn't self-adjust like drum brakes. It doesn't really matter which way you put it in. So slide it on, pry these shoes apart. There we go. Make sure the adjuster is fully seated. At this point, it is completely collapsed. The shoes are as close as they can possibly be, and that's where you want to start with when you have new shoes so that you can adjust them correctly. So at this point, let's put the rotor over, and this is where you're going to make your adjustment until everything is adjusted correctly. Slide the rotor on, and let's check for the adjustment of the shoes. Okay, I can hear them touch a little bit. So that's a good sign. However, what I will do now is apply the parking brake, and that will actually seat the shoes evenly left and right. Then we'll try again, because sometimes after you apply the parking brake, they are most likely going to have less contact once they've centered themselves up. A quick way to do this is to just go on the back side and pull on that lever with a pry bar that actuates the parking brakes instead of going up into the vehicle and applying the actual parking brake pedal. I am no longer hearing the shoes just like I thought. What I'm actually hearing is the other side. So I'm going to pull this back off, increase the distance on my adjuster just a little bit. A small adjustment goes a long way here, and then we'll try the same thing again. Okay, I can hear them touch just a little bit. That's exactly what you want from parking brake shoes. You don't want to hear them drag. You don't want to have resistance on the rotor. For these, they just have to be very close so that when you apply that parking brake pedal, they only have to expand a little bit until they catch and hold the vehicle. So I'm going to leave it adjusted as is. However, we have to pull the rotor back out to cover the hub in some anti-seize so it doesn't go on dry with no corrosion protection. With the hub nice and clean, apply some anti-seize to the surface so that you don't have corrosion building up. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs and of course also the parking brake shoes. And you want to keep it a nice thin layer because if you put too much, it's actually going to squish out when the rotor goes on and it's going to start flinging on the area where the parking brake shoes ride, and you don't want that to happen. Take your rotor and slide it on. To make sure it stays seated in place and doesn't move around, I'm going to put 2 lug nuts on and bottom them out gently. Take the caliper and slide it over the rotor. And put in your 2 bolts that mount it onto the axle. The torque on both of these bolts is 203 foot-pounds. All right, that's tight. From the back side of the backing shield, you'll see that it has a little cutout right there. That is where you're supposed to put the plug that covers up the hole through which you would adjust your parking brake shoes should they need adjustment. What I usually like to do is stick that little rubber cap on the end of my pry bar or screwdriver so I can push it in more easily since it's so deeply recessed in there. You can also put some silicone paste on the edges of it, that way it'll slide in much more easily, and that is installed. On the driver's side of the differential, you'll see where the fill plug is. We'll use a 3/8 drive extension, or directly the ratchet, to remove this plug so we can top off the fluid. There we go. If you have a Dana rear end, you're going to use 75W90 gear oil. If you have a Ford differential, which is what I have here, you're going to use 75W140 oil. Fill this up until it starts coming out of the fill hole. That's when you know it's fully topped off. Once that's full, reinstall the fill plug. Wipe off the area so it stops dripping, and tighten it up. That's bottomed out. Give it a little extra. That's plenty tight and sealed off. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 8 lug nuts. We'll bottom them out in a cross pattern, and also in a cross pattern, torque them to 165 foot-pounds. Once again, 165 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them if you want. And then of course, if your vehicle had these lug nut covers, go ahead and put these back on. Line them up. Tap them on, and there you have it. Don't forget to top off the master cylinder, pump up the brake pedal, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.